Chapter 2. Being a Patient. Anglo-American law starts with the premise of thoroughgoing self-determination. It follows that each man is considered to be the master of his own body, and he may, if he be of sound mind, expressly prohibit the performance of life-saving surgery. Nathanson Klein, I-960. The term illness, as we saw, refers to a condition of the body or its constituent parts. The term patient, on the other hand, refers to a social role occupied by a person, specifically the person who defines himself as ill, or more strictly, who stands in some socially recognized relationship to a medical professional or institution. The patient role. The concept of role, borrowed from the stage, plays a pivotal part in modern sociological, psychological, and psychiatric theories of behavior. Furthermore, even in everyday life, removed from theorizing about the workings of human personality, the concept of social role plays a very large and obvious part. We often identify ourselves and others in terms of our respective roles, for example, as sons, fathers, husbands, doctors, lawyers, and so forth. Roles are readily classified according to the social context or situation to which they belong, for example, familial, occupational, political, religious, and so forth. In the medical context, we recognize roles such as doctor, nurse, and patient, and their refinements, such as anesthesiologist, operating room nurse, and mental patient. Among the most important characteristics or functions of a social role are the following. 1. It identifies a comprehensive pattern of attitudes, behavior, and expectations. 2. It is publicly, often formally, identified as an entity. 3. It can be played by different individuals. 4. It is the principal criterion for identifying and situating persons in society. And 5. It often constitutes a strategy for coping with a recurrent type of situation or problem. Terms such as doctor, psychiatrist, patient, and mental patient all refer to roles in the sense used above. The fact that a role is a socially identified and recognized ensemble or entity, together with the fact that it can be played by different individuals more or less the same way, generates an important problem in everyday life. A problem especially acute in medical practice and most acute in psychiatry. The problem is that the uniformity of certain patterns, which we call a role, is only one side of the coin. Its other side is that a role hides and indeed obliterates the unique individuality of its occupant, who becomes, in the language of the law, fungible or exchangeable. We cannot have it both ways. As persons, we are considered to be unique individuals. As the occupants of roles, we are supposed to be like other occupants of the same role. Consider the following example. A man says to his family doctor, "My wife needs a psychiatrist." The statement implies that he would accept anyone his doctor recommends as a psychiatrist for his wife. By contrast, suppose he were to say, "I would not let anyone but Dr. Jones operate on me." This means that he wants one particular person as his surgeon. The fact is that the same or similar treatment of different persons suffering from the same disease is now considered to be the hallmark of rational medicine, so-called individualized treatment, smacking of being old-fashioned and unscientific. Here again, we face the fact that we cannot have everything in life. As patients, we cannot have both the personal care of the old-fashioned general practitioner and the scientific competence and technical skill of the modern super-specialist. As physicians, we cannot simultaneously play the roles of healer, compassionately caring for sick persons, and of technician, scientifically treating diseases. Becoming a patient. Medical and allied texts, as I have remarked earlier, deal with diseases and treatments. They do not deal with how physicians come into the presence of diseases, with what authorizes them to make pronouncements about sick persons, or with whether they may or may not intervene in these persons' lives. This situation reflects the fact that most people understand how a person becomes a physician. They are familiar with the education and certification a person must acquire to transform himself from a layman into a socially acknowledged, licensed, practicing physician. People thus understand that being a doctor and being a healer are two separate things, that some doctors are healers, but others, for example, forensic pathologists, are not, and that some healers are doctors, but others, for example, unorthodox practitioners or quacks, are not. However, Most people have no comparable understanding of how a person becomes a patient. They do not know, and often do not care to know, what a person must do or undergo to transform himself and be transformed by others from a non-patient into a socially acknowledged, certified patient. This is why people do not understand that being ill and being a patient are two separate things, that some patients are ill, but others, for example, healthy persons who go to physicians for routine checkups, or because they are afraid they are ill, are not, and that while some non-patients are healthy, others, for example, sick Christian Scientists who avoid physicians, are ill. Let me pause here for a moment and reconsider what we mean when we use the term patient. According to Webster's, a patient is a person under treatment or care, as by a physician or surgeon, or in a hospital. Of course, the concept of patient, like the concept of illness, may be defined by anyone. A person may feel unwell and consider himself to be a patient. His family may treat him as a patient. A physician may accept him as his patient, or a hospital may admit him as a patient. I use the term patient, unless otherwise qualified, as meaning a social role legitimized by appropriate medical and legal authorities. Understanding the transformations of persons into patients is crucial for our proper grasp of medicine and allied fields as practical endeavors. For only in theory do physicians deal with diseases. In practice, they deal with persons who may or may not be ill and who may or may not be patients. To put it differently, the practicing physician deals with diseases only through patients. Sick persons are, as it were, the carriers of diseases, or more specifically, of diseased bodies or body parts. We must therefore now ask, who owns a person's or patient's illness? The patient himself, his family, his physician, or the state? Similarly, if we view treatments not abstractly as chemotherapy or psychotherapy, but concretely as interventions performed by physicians on the bodies or minds of patients, we must ask, who owns medical or psychiatric treatment? The physician himself, his patient's family, or the state? Although these questions are about diseases and treatments, they are not medical questions. They are economic, moral, legal, and political questions. The anatomy of the medical situation. Language not only mirrors experience, but also shapes it. It not only reflects experience, but also refracts it. Language can thus both stimulate and inhibit experience. In contrast to our rich vocabulary for illness, it is the more remarkable how poor our vocabulary is with respect to identifying various kinds of doctor-patient relationships. This semantic impoverishment clearly is not a manifestation of our disinterest in this matter. Instead, our inability to name, simply and correctly, different dimensions of our experiences of being ill and seeking medical care reflects the mystification of aspects of our lives that are intensely important, but are, at the same time, also intensely embarrassing and frightening. The result is that we can describe certain conditions and interventions only with cumbrous circumlocutions and are often unable to identify them accurately. For example, we speak of persons as ill regardless of whether they are ill in body or mind, whether they consider themselves sick or are only so considered by others, whether they undergo treatment voluntarily or involuntarily. Thus, we are faced with a remarkable paradox. On the one hand, our culture displays a high degree of sophistication, both medical and lay, with respect to the diagnosis and treatment of the major bodily diseases. On the other hand, it displays an almost total lack of sophistication, both medical and lay, with respect to the rights and obligations of patients and doctors vis-à-vis themselves, each other, and the state. To remedy this situation, we need not more research, but more courage. The information we need to comprehend the ramifications of the doctor-patient relationship is at hand. What is missing is the willingness to clearly articulate that information by using words honestly and supporting their true meaning legally. Who owns the body? The view that the body is a biological machine, at once explicit and implicit in the practice of modern medicine, requires a decision about who controls, or, so to speak, owns the body. Having to make such a decision presupposes a departure from our Judeo-Christian heritage. Inasmuch as in that religious perspective, God is believed to have created and thus own everything, including our bodies and souls, the question of who owns the body is already answered and hence cannot arise. It is this religiously inspired understanding of our proper relations to our own bodies, note the verb as adjective, that accounts for traditional prohibitions not only against suicide, but also against eating certain foods, engaging in certain sexual acts, and during a long period of Christianity, even against certain medical treatments other than prayer or other church-approved methods. After the decline of religion during the Enlightenment, the state assumed many of the powers formerly enjoyed by the church, including certain powers over the bodies of persons as well as over persons themselves. The upshot is that different political systems impose different limits on self-ownership, theological and totalitarian systems allowing less and free societies more room for individual self-determination in matters of health. It is indeed impossible to grasp the historical origin and cultural significance of the idea of insanity without situating it clearly in the context of the medical situation of modernizing free societies. In this context, the role of patient specifically, the right of a competent adult to seek or reject care is quintessentially voluntary, and so is the role of physician specifically, his right to accept or reject a person as his patient. Clearly, in the social context of a market-oriented society, the medical situation is readily assimilated to the model of a voluntary transaction between buyer and seller, patient and physician. Since the voluntary exchange of goods or services for money is the normal mode of human relatedness in the marketplace, the doctor-patient relationship poses no problems so long as it is mutually consensual. While in a moment I shall suggest that we view the human body as if it were like an automobile, asserting that a person owns his body much as he owns his car would be oversimplifying the situation. Suffice it to emphasize here that in a free society such as the United States, a sane adult has a virtually unlimited right to reject medical interventions, whether diagnostic or therapeutic. I shall refrain from digressing into a discussion of the vast literature on this subject and will limit myself to citing 3 authoritative comments illustrating the American legal posture toward the right to reject medical interventions. The first is the classic case of In re Estate of Brooks, in which the courts upheld, even in an emergency situation, the patient's refusal of treatment. The second is former Chief Justice, then Circuit Judge, Warren Burger's frequently cited opinion concerning the constitutionality of allowing Jehovah's Witnesses to reject blood transfusion, even when the transfusion may be life-saving. Recalling Justice Louis Brandeis' words about our right to be let alone, Justice Burger added these decisive words. Nothing in this utterance suggests that Justice Brandeis thought an individual possessed these rights only as to sensible beliefs, valid thoughts, reasonable emotions, or well-founded sensations. I suggest he intended to include a great many foolish, unreasonable, and even absurd ideas which do not conform, such as refusing medical treatment even at great risk, emphasis in the original. Finally, Robert M. Bryn, a legal scholar, offers this summary of the situation. Every competent adult is free to reject life-saving medical treatment. This freedom is grounded, depending upon the patient's claim, either on the right to determine what shall be done with one's body, or the right of free religious exercise, both fundamental rights in the American scheme of personal liberty. Although Justice Burger bravely defends our right to hold foolish, unreasonable, and even absurd ideas, Bryn correctly emphasizes that the right to reject medical treatment is contingent on the agent's competence or sanity, a caveat that again underscores the pivotal role insanity plays in all of medicine, not just in psychiatry. The doctor-patient relationship. As we have seen, the core of the modern concept of illness rests squarely on the view that the body is a biological machine. The body is made in a certain way. It works in a certain way. It requires certain raw materials for its maintenance and proper functioning. It exhibits certain weaknesses and ways of reacting to injury. And finally, it decays and eventually ceases to function. Meshing with this materialistic, biological idea of illness is the view of the physician as a mechanic diagnosing and fixing the human body, and of the hospital as a garage where such repairs are carried out. This model offers a useful, albeit incomplete, account of the way modern physicians practice their craft. The account is incomplete because while doctors often think and sometimes like to believe that they practice their craft on human bodies, in fact, that is obviously not what they do. Actually, they practice their craft on bodies that are aspects or parts of human beings or persons. Hence, we must attend to how persons relate to bodies, their own and others, and to how physicians relate to the bodies and personalities, minds, of persons called patients. Let us, then, in the next few pages, treat the human body as if it were like an automobile. Automobiles belong to their owners. If a person chooses not to put oil in the crankcase and burns up the engine, that is his business. If he chooses to overload the car and cracks the frame, that is his business. And whether he chooses to take his car to a garage for a mechanic to fix is also his business. Furthermore, as the owners of automobiles are free to seek or avoid mechanics, so the adult members of free societies are, as a rule, free to seek or avoid physicians. Also, as a rule, people know equally little about the structure and function of their cars and of their bodies. Only rarely does a person take his car to a mechanic with a clear idea of what is wrong with it or how it should be fixed. Of course, sometimes a person does know, as when a tire goes flat. That is an obvious lesion with equally obvious remedies, repairing the tire or purchasing a new one. More often, however, a person takes his car to a mechanic with no such obvious lesion, but rather with obscure complaints. For example, the car stalls in traffic or does not accelerate properly. The mechanic examines the sick car, makes a diagnosis, and prescribes the treatment, a tune-up and new spark plugs. In other words, the owner of the automobile presents the mechanic with his car's symptoms. The mechanic examines the car, diagnoses its disease, and treats the lesions responsible for it. The medical parallel is obvious enough. When a person breaks an ankle skiing, the lesion is evident to both patient and doctor, but when he experiences increasing fatigue and weight loss, the lesion, if any, is likely to be far from obvious, and competent diagnostic studies will be needed to discover it. The important similarity between these two situations is that in each case, the relevant differences between the two parties pertain to two distinct issues, namely, their differing expertise about recognizing and repairing defects or diseases, and their differing legal authority over the problematic object. Typically, the owner of a malfunctioning automobile knows much less than his mechanic about the defects of automobiles and how to repair them, but the car belongs to him, not to the mechanic. Similarly, the patient usually knows much less than his doctor about diseases and treatments, but he, not the physician, has legal control over his body. Once a defect is discovered, these differences often become relatively unimportant. Both parties are now likely to agree that a lesion exists and should be repaired in a mutually agreeable manner. I schematize this situation in Table 2.1, Row 1. Doctor and patient agree about the nature of the illness and the proper remedy for it. Obviously, there is not always such an agreement between clients and experts. The parties may disagree about the existence or nature of the lesion, as well as about the reparative tactic appropriate or necessary for its relief. For example, although a car may have a poorly tuned engine, its owner might choose because he is negligent or has no money to continue driving it in its defective condition. Table 2.1, Being 3 and Being a Patient, Conventional Perceptions of the Person's Situation. Patient-physician relationship, if any. Social role, not being a patient. Bodily condition, no illness. 1. The sick person seeks medical help, assumes the patient role, the standard model of the good, sick patient. 2. The sick person does not seek medical help, does not assume patient role, the standard model of the sick non-patient, denial of illness, the sick Christian Scientist rejecting medical help. 3. The well person seeks medical help, assumes patient role, the standard model of the bad, non-sick patient, the malingerer, the neurotic. 4. The well person does not seek medical help, the standard model of the healthy person. The corresponding medical situation, comprising all the encounters in which demonstrably ill persons reject the patient role, is, as I have emphasized already, very important. A person may be ill with or without obvious symptoms or signs of illness, and yet choose, for many reasons, not to seek or receive medical attention. Whether or not a person is allowed to do so is a legal and political question. Sick prisoners often can, sick children, sometimes, sick psychotics, almost never. The important point again is that in free societies, sick adults, neither imprisoned nor declared insane, have a virtually unqualified right to avoid or reject medical care. Such persons are, of course, ill and may properly be said to have a disease, but they cannot, properly speaking, be said to be patients. This situation is represented in Table 2.1, Row 2. The person is ill but is not a patient. The opposite situation is equally important for medicine as well as psychiatry. The car is okay, but its owner claims it is not and wants it repaired. A healthy person claims to be sick and wants to be a patient. Although for obvious reasons, this situation occurs less often with respect to cars than bodies, it is not something I have contrived or imagined. Just as many people are now more interested in keeping their bodies fit than in doing something interesting or useful with them, so many people are more interested in keeping their cars in perfect shape than in using them. Let us assume that such a person hears his car squeak or rattle noises no one else can hear and takes it to his mechanic to have it checked and fixed. We know what will happen. Depending on circumstances, the automobile hypochondriac may be told that there is nothing wrong with his car or that it has some defect, which will be appropriately named, and needs fixing. In the latter case, having been provided with an automotive diagnosis and the semblance of fixing the trouble, the car owner will be satisfied and the mechanic will have made some money. When this situation occurs in medicine, its consequences are momentous, not just for the patient and his body, but also for medicine as an institution, for psychiatry, and for all of society. Here is the scenario. A person believing that he is sick goes to a doctor or clinic, or perhaps a succession of doctors and clinics. The doctors examine him and find nothing wrong with his body. What happens next? The doctor might tell the patient that he can find nothing to account for his symptoms, in short, that he is healthy. In the present cultural and medical climate of opinion, this is not likely to happen. Moreover, should it happen, it is unlikely to change the patient's conviction that he is ill. It is more probable that the doctor, though convinced that his patient is healthy, conjures up an impressive-sounding diagnosis, tells the patient that is what ails him, and prescribes treatment with a placebo, mild tranquilizer, or worse. There is a long list of such contrived medical diagnoses and treatments, their popularity subject to changes in fashion. In any case, the diagnosis secures for the patient the proof he is seeking and legitimizes him in the patient role with its myriad personal, social, and economic consequences. It also permits the physician to practice his craft vis-a-vis a much larger clientele than he could were he to identify such persons as healthy and hence not requiring medical services. Perhaps the reader is growing impatient, saying to himself something like this: obviously, these people are mentally ill. They are hysterics and hypochondriacs who believe they are ill, and that is their illness. Precisely. This is the crucial step, the decisive leap of faith, the shift in definition, the fatal professional compromise that physicians took about 100 years ago. They have clung to it and have tried to consolidate its catastrophic consequences ever since. Ostensibly, the modern scientific physician's professional mandate is to discover and treat bodily diseases. When he discovers evidence of disease, he says so. For example, the pathologist declares that a histological specimen of breast tissue shows evidence of malignancy. When he discovers no evidence of disease, he also says so. However, this rule is followed strictly only in relation to laboratory specimens and objective measurements, such as blood tests, Roentgenograms, and so forth. Confronted with persons whom doctors consider to be sick, not because they have demonstrable lesions, but because they are called patients, the rule doctors follow, indeed are expected to follow, is quite different. It is that such persons must under no circumstances be declared to be, or called, healthy. Faced with a healthy patient, the doctor must make a legitimate-sounding diagnosis. In other words, he must contrive or invent a non-existent disease. During the past century or so, doctors have invented two different kinds of such non-existent diseases, bodily and mental. Examples of the former are mythical disorders of the uterus and ovaries, especially popular in the United States, and mythical ailments of the liver, especially popular in France. Examples of the latter are all of the mental diseases, especially neurasthenia in the past, and the various anxiety and stress disorders today. Finally, both doctor and patient are encouraged to and may attribute mental, psychological disease to bodily, somatic causes and vice versa, the patient convincing himself that he has a real disease and the doctor that he is treating a real disease. Let me offer a few more remarks on why patients and doctors behave this way. As scientific advances in medical diagnosis accelerated during the second half of the 19th century, the physician confronted by a person complaining of undiagnosable ills faced a very serious dilemma. What should he tell such a person? And what should he tell himself? The most obvious option open to a physician in this situation is to tell both the patient and himself the truth, namely, that with the methods and knowledge presently available to him, he cannot find anything wrong with the patient's body. Such a stance, however, frustrates both patient and doctor. The former, because he wants to be legitimized in the patient role, the latter, because he wants to find disease so that he can prescribe treatment. This is why physicians rarely chose telling the truth in the past, and why, as the medical profession and the public have redefined the rules of the medical game, doing so has ceased to be an option altogether. The redefinition to which one refer consists of the physician following a new rule. Regardless of whether or not he can discover a somatic lesion to account for a patient's complaints, he must view the claimant as a bona fide patient and must declare him to be ill. Thus did doctors simultaneously invent symmetrical pairs of mental, fictitious diseases and mental, fictitious treatments for them. For example, all species of maladies and magnetization, Anton Mesmer. Neurasthenia and medically imposed rest, S. Weir Mitchell. Grand hysteria and hypnosis, Jean-Martin Charcot. General neuroses and faradization, Wilhelm Erb. Conversion hysteria and catharsis, Joseph Breuer. Actual and transference neurosis and psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, and so forth. Clearly, if disease means bodily disease, then mental diseases are metaphoric diseases, just as priests are metaphoric fathers. But this is precisely what is denied by all contemporary authorities and institutions that define the terms by which we must play the medical game. They unanimously declare that mental diseases are bona fide diseases, that metaphoric diseases are literal diseases. Conceptually, psychiatry, except insofar as it addresses bona fide brain diseases, thus rests on a literalized metaphor, Table 2.1, Row 3. To complete this survey of the combinations generated by the fact that the abnormal biological condition of a human being called illness and the assumption of the sick role called being a patient vary independently, we must briefly note the fourth and last situation. The person has a healthy body and does not seek medical attention, Table 2.1, Row 4. This is what we ordinarily mean by a healthy person. Table 2.1 displays, in condensed form, the four combinations that result from identifying the patient-physician encounter in terms of two variables: physicochemical abnormality of bodily structure or function, or literal illness, and assumption of the sick role, or being a patient. The information in this table rests on and embodies several assumptions or definitions, namely, that a disease is a physicochemical abnormality of the human body, that the presence or absence of disease is determined by the physician, that the role of patient is voluntarily assumed or avoided by the subject, and that the state, in its role as the political authority of society, does not interfere with the physician's judgment about illness or the individual's decision about assuming or rejecting the role of patient. This table highlights the fact that being ill and being a patient go together like love and marriage. That is, rarely. Yet most people now assume that persons who are ill are patients, and that persons called patients have diseases. Actually, most persons who have diseases are not patients because they do not believe they are ill, are poor, or have no access to medical care. And most patients have no diseases because communicating personal problems through complaints about the body is the universal language of mankind. Condition and role, a restatement. It is impossible to understand the problems mental illness poses for Americans, individually as potential mental patients and collectively as a society expected to cope with such patients, without a firm grasp of the differences between literal and metaphorical diseases and between biological conditions and social roles. I have described the core meaning of the idea of illness in the previous chapter and will devote a subsequent chapter to the analysis of mental illness as metaphoric disease. I now want to restate the basic distinction between being sick and being a patient in somewhat different terms. Today, most educated persons understand the differences between a person having been killed and having been murdered, between a person being a killer and being a murderer. But few people now understand the differences between having a disease and being a patient, between being sick and being in the sick role. Actually, killing and murder stand in the same sort of relation to each other as do having a disease and being a patient. The extent to which this analogy falls flat is a measure of the injury which modern medical thinking has inflicted on our understanding of human rights and responsibilities. Killing and sickness are facts. Being officially categorized as a murderer or patient are ascriptions or roles. Thus, a person may be killed, for example, by lightning without having been murdered, and a person may be considered to be a murderer, for example, an innocent person convicted of murder without having killed anyone. Similarly, a person may be sick, for example, suffering from hypertension without knowing it, and not be a patient, and a person may be considered to be a patient, for example, by faking illness to avoid the draft or obtain damages for alleged injuries without being ill. Yet the modern, scientifically enlightened person instinctively rejects the disjunction between illness and the sick role and insists that everyone who is sick is ipso facto a patient, and that everyone who is called a patient is sick. This posture, generally regarded as both compassionate and scientific, is manifested by the intense intolerance shown toward persons believed to be physically ill who reject the patient role, and, to some extent, also toward those who play the patient role even though they are believed to be not physically ill. Individuals falling into the latter group used to be regarded as malingerers, a concept emblematic of the understanding that a healthy person can play the role of a sick person. Now malingerers are regarded as suffering from factitious illnesses, a concept emblematic of the rejection of the very possibility of a disjunction between illness and the sick role. For further discussion, see Chapter 5. Why does a person become a patient? Since, for the most part, people do not like being sick, one might be tempted to say that they are forced into the patient role. In a sense, that is often true, but it is important that we distinguish between the two radically different senses in which persons are forced into the roles of patient and mental patient. Choice and the patient role. Ordinarily, people avoid doctors and the patient role. It is when a person experiences pain or some other bodily discomfort that the fear of illness and the hope of relief from pain and disease force him, as it were, to seek out medical services. The person visits his physician or goes to a hospital emergency room. Actually, such a person chooses to enter the role of medical patient, a choice often concealed by the fact that the patient may feel that, in his condition, he has no choice but to seek medical help. However, the phrase "no choice" is here a figure of speech. The person has a choice legally, psychologically, and practically, but it is a choice in which the desire to seek the patient role may far outweigh the desire to avoid it. People also avoid psychiatrists and the role of mental patient. I disregard, for the moment, the truly voluntary mental patient, who seeks psychiatric help much as the medical patient seeks medical help. Since, for the most part, people do not like being mental patients, one might be tempted to say that they, too, are forced into that role. Indeed, that is true. However, persons are forced into this role literally by other people. Typically, the mental patient does not choose to enter the role he is in, a lack of choice readily concealed by the fact that, confronted with the overwhelming powers aligned against him, he may elect to seek psychiatric care. In other words, the patient with bodily illness, experiencing suffering, is driven to go to a hospital by pain, whereas the patient with mental illness, making others suffer, is driven to a mental hospital by the police. The similarities and differences between bodily illness and mental illness are like the similarities and differences between the ways the word driven is used in these two sentences. This is why I insist that the term voluntary mental patient is problematic. The would-be mental patient may have no choice but to accept the role, for if he does not become a mental patient voluntarily, he could, through commitment, be compelled to become one involuntarily. I shall say more about this later. Medicine and the state, from treating patients to treating diseases. Our vocabulary for describing the medical situation is not only impoverished, it is also one-sided. We are accustomed to defining the sphere of medical action in terms of the organ system or type of patient the doctor treats. For example, we identify doctors as dermatologists, cardiologists, nephrologists, neurologists, or as pediatricians or geriatricians. These distinctions do not help lay people to recognize who controls the medical transaction or how it is controlled. Yet, as medicine is increasingly politicized, both doctors and patients are increasingly imperiled if they overlook the elements of power and control in their relationship to each other and to third parties, especially the state. In the 19th century, the elements of power and control in the medical situation were less problematic, if only because they were more overt. Privately practicing physicians caring for private patients were the agents of the patient. Psychiatrists were the agents of the state. And physicians working in charity hospitals caring for the poor were primarily the agents of medical education and medical science, rendering the patient care only insofar as it did not conflict with that mandate. Today, the situation, especially in the United States, is radically different. Everyone now expects the practicing physician to be the patient's agent, and everyone pretends that he is the patient's agent, although the patient rarely pays the physician directly for his services. The result is the economic, ethical, legal, and political disorder that characterizes the present medical scene. It is not within the scope of this study to address this conundrum. However, I want to offer a few remarks on what is now happening in American medicine, because certain current developments in the so-called delivery of health services illuminate the problems of psychiatry and vice versa. The distinction between having an illness and being a patient, or more specifically, between treating an illness and treating a patient, which has always bedeviled psychiatry, is now coming to plague medicine as well. However obvious this distinction might be, it has not prevented the most influential men and women concerned with health policy in the United States from constructing a scheme for reimbursing hospitals based on the fictitious principle that doctors treat diseases, not patients. The monster called psychiatry is a monument to what happens when physicians are entrusted with treating diseases regardless of what the patients desire, consent to, or are willing to pay for. In collaboration with American politicians, American physicians have now created a similar monster and have called it the DRGs, diagnosis-related groups. While at the moment this system of reimbursing hospitals applies only to patients covered by Medicare or Medicaid, physicians and hospital administrators expect and fear that, in an effort to control costs, other third-party payers, in particular insurance companies such as Blue Cross Blue Shield, will adopt a similar policy. Although the ostensible aim of the DRG system is to control costs, only an idiot would accept that rationalization. Its real aim is to further bureaucratize and mechanicalize the system and depersonalize and depower both the patient and the physician. In short, the DRGs at once symbolize and sanction a system of medical care in which physicians treat and are expected to treat, or even must treat, diseases. They do not treat and cannot treat patients, clients, customers. See Chapter 4. Perhaps this is a case of divine retribution. During recent decades, physicians refused to resist the temptation of feeding at the public trough, unhesitatingly betraying their patients and themselves by offers of largesse from the state. To make more money, all the physician had to do was shift the cost from the patient to the state, taxpayer, and the dollars poured in. Now the politicians and medical bureaucrats who hold the money bag are tightening the strings. How do they do it? By taking seriously what they have learned. Clearly, doctors have stopped treating patients and have switched instead to treating diseases. But, unlike patients, diseases are similar to one another. Like cans of tuna fish, toilet seats, or baseball bats, they are what the lawyers call fungible. So why should the government pay, say, $500 for treating Jones's pneumonia and $5,000 or $50,000 for treating Smith's? Now doctors are beginning to wake up from the nightmare they have brought on themselves. However, perhaps because they have been asleep too long, they do not see very clearly. Thus, the first thing they do is wail, like frightened children, that they are innocent. In other words, that it is not their fault that different patients suffering from the same disease do not necessarily require the same length of treatment. But the physicians and politicians who have created the DRG system know that. We must therefore look for a more subtle or repressed explanation for what has happened. What I think has happened, briefly put, is this. As patients stopped and third parties started to pay doctors, doctors lost interest in pleasing the patients and became more interested in pleasing those who pay them, that is, insurance companies, regulated by the government, and the state. How do you please a patient? By making him feel better and respecting his wishes. How do you please a bureaucracy? By dramatizing and justifying the great things you are doing for your impersonal beneficiaries. This is how the American people fell into the stupor of believing that doctors treat and cure diseases. Now physicians and patients alike are discovering that that is not so. As a cancer specialist, writes a physician in the New York Times, I often see patients who are not candidates for chemotherapy, radiation treatment, or surgery, but nonetheless need hospital care. Not treating cancer is one thing, not treating a person is another. Indeed, complains the writer, a physician stupid enough to care for such a patient too conscientiously can be labeled a Medicare abuser. It does not seem to occur to this physician, or probably to other physicians and laypeople, that there may be a connection between this impending persecution of doctors who want to take care of patients as they think they ought to, and the persecution of ordinary men and women throughout the world who want to take care of their own lives as they think they ought to. Physicians have eagerly embraced the practice of labeling people as drug abusers, wife abusers, child abusers, and the abusers of everything else in sight, even though these persons were not sick, were not their patients, and wanted to have nothing to do with the medical profession. Now, it is the physician's turn to be stigmatized and persecuted for trying to help patients, just as they have stigmatized and persecuted people who have tried to help themselves. After all, can we be sure that helping others by bankrupting the economy is any less dangerous than helping oneself by ingesting chemicals? A medical profession prostituted to the state calls dangerous? In vain will doctors try to use the word help once their adversaries have taken control of the vocabulary. The doctor's duty is clear. He must ensure that American medicine assumes responsibility for dealing with the plague of Medicare abuse threatening the nation. Accordingly, psychiatrists must immediately organize clinics and hospitals for the treatment of patients afflicted with Medicare abuse. Surely, we cannot permit sick doctors, harboring the delusion that their duty is to treat patients instead of diseases, to endanger the health and well-being of the American people. Toward a more candid identification of the medical situation. Perhaps the time is approaching when a suggestion I made some 20 years ago might be timely. I then proposed that the psychiatrist's social position vis-a-vis his client should be clearly defined. Does he represent the interests of the patient, as defined by the patient, or of others, the patient's family, society, and so forth? This division of functions would reflect the fact that the practicing psychiatrist is usually the agent of one party and the antagonist of another. I advocate a clear social recognition and professional codification of this situation. The psychiatric patient has long been a party in conflict with other parties, but was treated nevertheless as if he simply had a disease. Of course, he is still so treated. Now the physician is being forced to become a party in conflict with other parties, but is expected to act as if he were simply treating diseases. This situation is bound to get worse before it gets better. Why? Because I believe it can get better only if we are willing to recognize what we have not been willing to recognize, namely, who controls the medical transaction, how it is controlled, and what its real aims are. Such recognition would require heretofore unseen candor, as well as genuine medical, economic, and political self-disclosure on the parts of doctors, insurance carriers, and politicians. Then, and only then, could we articulate and acknowledge certain already existing categories of medical practice, such as the following: scientific medicine, for medicine under the control of the medical profession; police medicine, for medicine in the service of the police; executionary and military medicine, for medicine used for killing; forensic medicine, for medicine in the interests of litigants and law enforcement; entrepreneurial medicine, for medicine as a free trade; socialized medicine, for medicine as a state-supported and controlled trade; professional medicine, for medicine as a profession in the traditional sense of that word, and so forth. After all, it is folly to ignore the proverbial warning that he who pays the piper calls the tune. A comparison of human medicine with veterinary medicine makes clear the danger that threatens us. From the descriptive point of view, the difference between the physician and the veterinarian is that the former treats human diseases or sick people, whereas the latter treats animal diseases or sick animals. From the moral and political point of view, the difference between them is that the physician is expected to be the agent of the persons who are his patients, whereas the veterinarian is expected to be the agent of persons who own sick animals. In proportion, then, as the physician becomes the agent of the state, and in proportion as the state is totalitarian, the physician becomes, from a moral and political point of view, a veterinarian, that is, the agent of a state that owns its citizens, just as the farmer owns his animals. This is why killing animals is part of the normal function of the veterinarian, and why incarcerating people is, and killing them may yet become, a part of the normal function of the physician employed by the therapeutic state.